Hi everybody, thanks so much for coming. This is the first of our academic workshops for our pilot urban room. So to some extent it is very much a pilot. So Henrik Schoenefeldt is running the first session. It's Marginalised Heritage. It might involve a walk around at the end, but it's comprised of a presentation from Henrik and then a workshop and kind of dialogue session. And really it's about the spirit of the urban room is to bring together academic expertise and people from the community and the council, and to get that triangulation taking place. So Henrik has put a lot of work into this workshop, and we're hoping this is a kind of pilot for that. So actually input that you provide here can help this develop, and we'll use it in the future as well for both teaching and for the next phase of our urban room, which this is all a precursor to. So, Henrik, over to you.
Just to say a little bit about myself, so I'm currently Professor for Sustainable Heritage at the University of Kent, and my sort of academic interest really is the sustainability of the historic built environment, and particular understanding how sort of environmental thinking is not something that's just modern, but something that has a history to it in its own right. And this history goes back centuries. So this sort of idea that we're thinking about the impact of buildings on the environment, or how buildings can respond to the local environment better, is not a new idea. There's a long history. And this is one of my core areas of research I'm doing as an academic and what I'm writing. But I'm also working on a big project. So I'm an academic lead on the Palace of Westminster Restoration Renewal Program in London, where I spend 3 days a week, and then 2 days at the university to do postgraduate teaching. So that's generally so just give a little bit of my background. And this interest in this subject, the marginalized heritage, is actually touching on very closely to my interests, because I'm looking at aspects of heritage that historians have historically had no interest in. And this is particularly, so when we're thinking about heritage, a lot of people might think about the architectural significance, that a building is really impressive architecturally. It might say something about a particular historic moment in time in which that building might be associated. There might be an interesting civic history associated with a particular historic building. But aspects of building, certain aspects of building that tend not to be looked at. And this includes, for instance, what happened in historic buildings back of house, for instance. What were the spaces like when you were back of house? And who were the people who occupied and lived and worked in these back of house spaces? And they are those spaces generally, when you think about conservation, that tend to be not as well as protected as maybe a grand hall in the town hall. Doesn't might give a lot of attention of conservation, while the back of house areas like old kitchens, basements, and so on are treated as more utilitarian spaces that can always be adapted to modern needs, where there's less restriction and so on. So what I'm really quite interested in is almost shifting the focus away slightly from what we already given so much attention to something that's maybe invisible. So this word marginalized heritage has essentially two meanings here. One is actually a social one in the literal sense. So so in the same way that we're talking about maybe social inclusion in new housing developments, you know, that's also do with, it can mean marginalized in that way, but it's also about those aspects of heritage that we have just neglected, sometimes deliberately and sometimes unconsciously, and sometimes it might be an expression of a complete rejection of certain heritage that we don't recognize as worth preserving. And what I would like to do today in this workshop is to slightly open up a little bit of a conversation around what we consider preserving and what we consider heritage. And after have a workshop session where we're essentially learning a technique where we're exploring how we can shift our lens slightly. So that's generally the setting. So it's going to be quite so broad philosophically, and I will start off essentially the session with doing an introduction to engaging with the idea of marginalized heritage, so really exploring what do we mean by this concept and what it means specifically also to a place like Chatham. And I want to just to make that link clear in the beginning, in Chatham we have a lot of heritage as recognized as heritage, but we also got a lot of the urban fabric that is shaped by developments of the latter part of the 20th century, that people wouldn't recognize as something of heritage, let alone as something they're proud of or worth preserving. And in the light of climate change, etc., for instance, and the environmental impact that for instance, the removal of building and the replacement we might have to make that shift our perspective slightly to recognize even those buildings that we don't love have a value and a significance to it. But how do we deal with that? We have got one building that's across the road that probably a lot of people don't love, but it's an expression of a particular moment in time. So, you know, the Manhattan building there, the shopping center just underneath and behind it is also an expression of a very particular time, the 70s, 80s Britain, consumers' culture and so on. And they require us a slight shift in perspective to order to understand what does this mean as they are part of our heritage. If we want it or not, they're part of our history. And how do we deal with that part of history that we're feeling slightly uncomfortable with or not us have the same level of affinities to than, let's say, a 17th century townhouse or a theatre or a 19th century church. To know that we have a different relationship to these buildings. We would like to explore as part of this marginality is we see these buildings are marginalized in a sense, and I would like to explore that. And so there's going to be introducing this theory, and then we're going to do a practical workshop where you're going to actually be doing your own reflections in little groups around these questions. How do we dealing with these kinds of unloved heritage that we might not even recognize as such? And I hope that we have enough time at the end to do an informal explorative walk looking at 3 sites that would be categorized as unloved buildings, and how could we imagine a kind of Margate where these buildings have a role to play, but we take ownership of them. So that's sort of hope to do. So that's just the scene setting, and so starting off with part 1. So gauging with the idea. So what I'm going to be doing essentially initially, and this is going to be the talk part of this, the main talk part of it, is to just introduce you to the idea of what we mean by marginal heritage, because there has been an ongoing debate in the academic literature on the subject and also in the field of conservation and urban planning. And I think it's really important to realize and engage with that kind of debate to help us see our built environment slightly differently. And this is the book which was actually published about 15 years ago in Germany. And what is really interesting about this book, this is actually a book written about what they're calling grey architecture. And what they mean by grey architecture they're talking about ordinary buildings that were built after the Second World War to meet the basic needs of people, with essentially housing in most cases. And what is really interesting is in a lot of German cities, they adopted quite a good urbanism, a sort of medium density urbanism with courtyard buildings. So, and if you're thinking like cities like Düsseldorf, for instance, which was bombed and then rebuilt. So so what you will see is you're seeing very clear urbanism, strong urbanisms of courtyards and streets and squares. But the buildings themselves are quite plain. They're quite ordinary, you might say. They're not grand, ornate facades of buildings, but they were robustly built. They're very adaptable, but they're not considered architecture in the traditional sense. So architectural historians tend to really prioritize looking at grand architectural edifices as seen as a cultural achievement. What actually countries like Britain also, and Germany, they had to rebuild a lot. And the architecture that came out of this was a big societal achievement to actually rebuild at that scale that had been done necessary at that time. And the architecture was shaped by the circumstances of which those buildings were built. And the architecture in some way is a reflection of that. Just in the same way that maybe a timber frame building from Tudor times reflects a particular culture, so does the post-war architecture, or 1970s or 1980s architecture. And what is interesting about this book is in the introduction, so the graue Architektur, which means grey architecture, is that So what I think is really significant about this introduction, because this book was actually quite groundbreaking. Welcome. So what was quite groundbreaking is that this book has actually essentially shifted the lens away from grand buildings, of which there are a lot in Düsseldorf as well, towards those buildings of those mass, what makes up the mass of the city, which is essentially apartment blocks and urban courtyard buildings that houses most of the people living in this place. And I want to just read out this. This is a translation that I've done of the original German text, because there is currently no English translation of this, which I find it's a shame, because this is actually, I think, quite a remarkable piece of scholarship. And so what the author, actually, Benedict Buchsein, writes is, the mass of building which makes the body of the city has escaped the gaze of architectural history. Its method and language originally evolved to service the study of significant buildings. Although possible, large collection of building efforts, although possibly the largest collective building effort of the 20th century, the rebuilding of Germany after the Second World War has benefited little from the possibility of a non-elitist culture of architectural criticism. So the particular last line, I think, is very punchy and making a really strong point, is that essentially the eyes of the architectural historian has been quite blind to the majority of buildings that make our built environment. And that might be a similar way in conservation. We think about conservation terms. Are we getting blind to looking at the city as holistically as a whole, including everything within it? You still might come up with develop values and judgments about aspects of the built environment, but it's first of all to just accept that our built environment is much more diverse, heterogeneous than it might appear if you just look at it through buildings that are listed. And I think that sort of angle is something that I would like to explore, what this might mean to when we're thinking about heritage in buildings. And just to give you an example, so this is one of these grey architectures in Düsseldorf. So you can see they're actually carefully built buildings. They're not grand, but they fulfill a social function, and they meet a social need of its time, and they have also survived the changes of time. They're very well adaptable. They might not necessarily meet modern requirements of energy efficiency, so you're seeing a lot of these buildings being retrofitted to meet modern requirements, but they are cultural testimonies to an era of rebuilding. So this is great architecture. What is interesting is that Buchsein, the author of this book, of course, was not the first one to make such an observation that maybe the way we study architecture is so narrow that we see a lot of built environment we can't actually see. So, and what actually author does do, it refers back to work in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And I don't know whether you're all familiar with Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown. They are architects and theorists of architecture in the United States, writing really quite provocative theoretical exposition in the 60s and early 70s. And you might have heard of the book Learning from Las Vegas. That book is a slightly later publication of an article they have written for the Architectural Forum in 1968, where they're making the case that places like Las Vegas might not be a place that architects would consider architecture, let alone be something that architectural historians or urbanists would really give much attention to as something you can learn something from. So this title, Learning from Las Vegas, is quite provocative, and you might read this slightly polemically, because when you read this text, it's certainly polemic, but it's meant to wake up architects and architectural historians and theorists to realize that our theory needs to open up more to looking into what is our world now, what is it really like, rather than living in this sort of like idealized architectural environment that will never materialize. And Las Vegas is an extreme case because it's essentially kind of popular architecture, you might say. And that sort of bold expression of the culture of the motor car that comes with this, the kind of popular expression of a culture of gambling and so forth. Whatever you think about it, it's still there. And it's something that you should look at as part of our human culture. So that is very important. So 1968, somebody was already making this point that maybe architectural historians are much more too narrowly focused. They have got these rather rose-tinted glasses on that doesn't make us see everything. And what I think really provocative is actually the beginning paragraph of this articles, where they're actually making a really important point. So they say, Denise Scott Brown and Robert Ventura are writing here, learning from the existing landscape is a way of being revolutionary for an architect. Not the obvious way, which is to tear down Paris and begin again, as Le Corbusier suggested in the 1920s, but another way which is more tolerant. That is to question how we look at things. So to be revolutionary is here in the way we look at things, not necessarily in the tearing down and rebuilding. And that was actually what Denise and Scott Brown were doing in this sort of rather provocative way of looking at Vegas in a different light. And then they go on and saying architects are out of the habit of looking not judgmentally at the environment, because orthodox modern architecture, so what they're meaning here really is the orthodoxy of modernism that emerged in the early 20th century Europe and then spread across the United States and then globally, is that the orthodox modern architecture is progressive, if not revolutionary, utopian, puristic. It is dissatisfied with the existing condition. Modern architecture has been anything but permissive. Architects have preferred to change the existing environment rather than enhance what is there. I think we could read this is so topical, isn't it? And I find so this thing, these key words on being non-judgmental, and also to looking in what's already there, what's existing in there, what can we do with it as it is, rather than trying to make everything, mold everything to this sort of perfect image of a city. So we got the legacies of the 20th century here in the town, and we want to really think about them in a different way than we might have done in the past. Start thinking about it at least. So does that make sense? So then we'll be looking at Chatham, essentially, which I've sort of highlighted before, is essentially we are inviting everyone now to look at Chatham's urban heritage in a slightly different light. Essentially, and I might describe this as the unseen and dismissed inheritance of past urbanisms that we're seeing expressed in Chatham. We are right next to one of them. So much as this urbanism is interestingly, and I did a little bit of research into this, understanding a little bit more what actually happened in Chatham, in particular in the 70s and 80s, and what we're seeing actually a lot of the bold architectural interventions that have happened are very much in the light of the Thatcherized period, and this is the 1970s and 1980s. British culture are very strongly expressed in this kind of architecture, and this is a culture of the car and consumerism very strongly. And I don't mean it here in this case in a non-judgmental way. And this asks us to reflect on the values by which we evaluate the existing fabric, or even our future plans for its transformation. It might ask us to understand what were the values that gave rise to these buildings in the first place. So there is a sort of triangular relationship between where we are now, how we're looking at it, how it was looked at in the past, and how we might move to looking at it differently for our future plans. So that's a sort of generally the sort of theoretical focus of this work. And I would say that what we're dealing with here is a question, or we might call it a crisis of values. So of course, what we really want to think about is really basic question is, what is heritage? What do we include or exclude from the canon of heritage, and why? Through which lens or lenses are we looking? What values are guiding us? We might not be always aware of them. Whose values are they in the first place? Are their own values? Are they the values of a particular profession that has got the privilege to make those judgments? Or is it the voice of anyone living in the community? That makes a big difference. So which voices are we hearing and which ones are we not hearing? Is it deliberate? Is it unconscious that some voices are heard or not? I want to start off with that actually everyday architecture, so we might call it the everyday heritage, is not something that's necessarily completely unrecognized of having heritage significance. So the UNESCO World Heritage Lists has a lot of social housing projects includes a lot of social housing projects in places like Berlin and Vienna in particular. And here's just a few examples of actually 6 estates that were built in Berlin in the 20th century, in the first half of the 20th century, that are tourist attractions that are protected as valuable heritage and are still fulfilling its social function as housing for people. So the fact that it's just social housing in itself is not necessarily a deterrent for it to be recognized as heritage, but its architecture architecturally, these buildings are much more recognizably of significance. So there's a very strong emphasis on the cultural, these being architects design estates that have a strong urbanism, that have a strong architecture, it's very expressive, that be recognized as heritage. But this is only a small section of the housing stock still. And what we have seen in Britain, in particular in the post-war social housing project, so what we call maybe the architecture of the welfare state, has experienced a different fate. And here's just 2 examples: the Robin Hood Gardens from 1972 by Alison and Peter Smithsons. So the Western Bloc is now completely demolished. Here's just a photograph of it being demolished. It was just in the same way that those projects in Berlin were an expression of a particular vision of urbanism, a particular vision of how we can accommodate people on low incomes in dense urban environments. So architecture for the working population, which made up the majority of people. Here, the demolition of a building of a similar era, also brutalism, but the civic building, in this case, a library in Birmingham, sadly being demolished. And there are buildings that don't have advocates. They're buildings that don't have advocates, but maybe the 20th century society tries to mobilize people, trying to protect buildings like this, but we're seeing lots of them disappearing at rapid rates, whether it's through dynamites or diggers. And this is a photograph from an architecture magazine when this Robin Hood Gardens was opened first time in Poplar, in a very poor area of London, and it was presented as a shining new beacon of modernism, a shining beacon of new kinds of housing where we're really caring for housing people in decent conditions. So, and this is the area of big slum clearance projects where people saw in this an alternative to the Victorian back-to-back housing, which lots of the working population of Poplar would have lived in. And lots of stocks of that still exist to this day. So we need to really seeing that this is very much an expression of its time, of the 70s period. This building has disappeared, and what is really interesting is part of it has ended up in the museum, and it's actually ended up in the new V&A museum building. It's been actually built in Stratford. That's an East V&A East out, essentially outpost to the grand buildings in South Kensington. And what is really interesting is that actually the V&A is curator of contemporary architectural collections. So they've got a curator who looks after collection of items in their collection that are belonging to contemporary architecture. So Neil Bingham, and he writes that the V&A's acquisition of a section of Robin Hood Gardens, complete with front and back facade, will motivate new thinking research into this highly experimental period of British architectural and urban history. So the museums are recognizing something is being lost. Now the only way we can actually hark back to that history of this period is through museum artifacts. So they're no longer living heritage in this sense. But also, very clearly is that this demolition they're seeing clearly as a kind of cultural catastrophe, and the museums take on some sort of role in maintaining at least the cultural awareness of that sort of urban history that's disappearing. And here's this example of this. There's an atrium space in the middle of this museum that has these bits of the facade hanging. So this is one of the sections of it, of this kind of Robin Hood Garden, suddenly becoming a museum artifact in the East Storehouse, a salvage section. And what is interesting, this sits in the same building as a 15th century ceiling in the Toils Palace, which we would always recognize as heritage. So they sit alongside each other. So I think that makes a clearly a strong statement. And so it really tries to make that museums actually interested in maintaining cultural memories of an era that's gradually replaced by new developments. Where and what is interesting is when we're thinking about keeping memories, even if it's only through objects in the museum, there are some really radical places where that rejection of those historic monuments, if you might call them, of the welfare state, where there was the demolition wasn't just purely an economic one, where you gave land to a developer who would then demolish and rebuild, and the completely sort of capitalist kind of venture. It might also be political. So, and one place where that is really interestingly expressed is in Berlin, in East Berlin, where after the Berlin Wall came down and Germany reunified and the city reunified, you certainly had monuments of the former East German regime sitting bang in the middle of the new unified Berlin. And this is the Palast der Republik, or the Palace of the Republic. It's essentially the parliament, so in vertical commas, of East Germany, with the famous radio tower in the background, which nobody doubts about its architectural significance. This building doesn't exist anymore. It's demolished. And this was a deliberate political decision to do so, to erase essentially a kind of civic architecture that belonged to the former East German regime. This doesn't mean that all East German architecture has disappeared. There are quite a lot of East German architectural heritage that's deliberately being listed. So particularly like theater buildings, some administrative buildings with murals and so on. But in this case, we are seeing an expression of cultural rejection of political nature. And what's really interesting is when this was happening, there was actually a bit of a debate going on around whether it was right to demolish it, but also what to replace it with afterwards. And there was a movement coming who was suggesting we're going to rebuild the old Baroque city palace. And there was actually a popular movement behind it. And what they did as part of the kind of promoting this idea in the early to mid-90s, they built essentially a scaffolding mock-up of the city palace right next to the Palast der Republik, still standing there. To seeing, actually, we're going to return bits of the Berlin back to its pre-socialist state, because this palace, interestingly, wasn't actually destroyed entirely in the Second World War. It was demolished by the East German regime in the same, as a political rejection, act of political rejection of a kind of bourgeois, monarchical kind of history of Berlin. So then when they demolished the remains of the palace, there was also an act of cultural rejection. This is a picture of it actually standing there. I think it's quite remarkable, I think, in terms of the debate, in terms of when thinking about debate around these issues. And this is actually being built, believe it or not. That is only opened about 3 years ago. It's a rebuilt Baroque palace Although it's been more nuanced, when you go there, you can actually see not only bits of facade and the court has been reconstructed, there's also bits where the modern architecture shines through to it. One sees it, the whole thing. It's just a stage set. But what I think is very interesting about this project, it illuminates a kind of value system that we are applying to when we make decisions about what to keep and not, and what we replace it with. These are big projects where the German central government would have had to say in. The city municipalities would have had to say in. There was some level of public engagement, but we're seeing other expressions of a kind of reinterpreting that we're seeing in more smaller objects. And I don't know whether you remember this in Bristol, the Edward Colston statue being pulled down from its pedestal and thrown into the canal. You might have your view about treating heritage like that, but I think what is actually quite important about that event is this is showing a confrontation between a kind of cultural monument that was created in the 19th century to commemorate a particular individual that was at the time as seen somebody significant to the municipality and also the wider Britain. What was, of course, excluded in the portrayal is, of course, that this person was part of the slave trade. The enslavement of Black people around the world was part of the colonial capitalist system at the time. And the acceptance of having statues like this unchallenged standing in the urban realm that meant to be for everyone has been expressed in this. They're saying we are no longer accepting this. These statues just to stand there and to be this kind of monument to a kind of colonial era that the Black Lives Matter movement have actually decided to stimulate the debate by pulling down the statues and even having it covered in graffiti. And now it sits in the museum. And it sits in a museum where actually the transformation, so this object is no longer what it was before the event. It's been transformed by these movements into something else that says something about our own age, as well as something about the age on which the statue was first produced. And it is a memory to this active engagement with questions of heritage and what it means and how its meaning might change. This has changed its meaning. It's become an object for discussion. And this, I think, that is why I personally think this act, if you call it, you might call it vandalism, but you might also call it a reinterpretation, act of rather violent reinterpretation, but probably a necessary one. And you can have your own views on that, but I think it stimulated debate around the meanings of things, the values they represent, and the values that we hold now are being in conflict with those. When we put this into perspective, so thinking about vandalism, some people might see it that way, is that there's, interestingly, we actually have some form of vandalism that's actually now heritage. So if you think about graffiti, and you got here the Historic England's advice of what you do if you got graffiti on historic buildings, which is a nuisance, and is seen as something that's a problem that needs to be eliminated and dealt with. But it's also interesting, on the other hand, we got graffiti in 18th century churches of St. Mary's, Whitby, where sailors were coming to church and carving little profiles of ships that were in the harbor of Whitby into the pews. And that is now treasured as part of the history of that parish, of the cultural history of that parish. So what might be considered a kind of vandalism is now actually an expression of a kind of voiceless part of the population that found expression in these tiny little carvings in the woodwork. And architectural historians, art historians, are looking at this now as a rare expression of a kind of working class culture of sailors being on the sea, and the way those images may be telling us something about them. So, and that is the question is, when we're seeing this happening in more modern context, it's all the kind of people's interfering with the building that we might see as vandalism or nuisance, some way not also telling us something about those people living there. And what does it mean? And this is interesting, is sometimes graffiti can be also used as a provocative device. And we're seeing this in Canterbury Cathedral recently, and I don't know whether anybody of you had a chance of going there, actually. And it's very divisive. I personally think it is actually a really interesting intervention, because remember, it's only temporary. It's done with a lot of care that these things can be removed afterwards. So this is not graffiti that's going to make lasting damage to the building. But it was actually orchestrated by the cathedral as a way of stimulating debate about our modern society, the meanings of faith and so forth. As a religious institution.
Made it across to America. J.D. Vance did tweets on it. International event.
And there was a lot of provocation. But what it did do, because it was provocative, and you got those, some people just doing this rather bold rejection statements, but there was a lot of more nuanced debate around it. It really sparked discussion. So as a result, that act, that artistic intervention that's being done here, where a poet writes kinds of words and they're transformed into kinds of graffiti, and graffitis, of course, do exist in cathedrals, historic graffitis we find there too. So it's not completely out of place, that it is a kind of engagement. So I just want to sort of put that sort of into the room as another way of maybe looking at this. So coming back to the sort of question of meaning making, so this is one of the things that come here, is that people have made meaning of a statue, a new meaning of the statue, through those acts. The Black Lives Matter movement has made it expressed his values against an existing heritage. But what is important also is we have got a lot of heritage of buildings, our built environment, that's no longer in use. There's now become disused, whether it's a shop, whether it's a light industrial building, whether it's a farm complex. There is this sort of question of actually particular places of work that become disused and no longer of a future because those industries are gone, particularly like coal mining. So here, this is an example in Hamm, which is on the east end of the Ruhr district in Germany, where this is the last coal mine, deep cast coal mine in Germany to close. This is about 15 years ago. And it has, and this is essentially the tower, and called a hammer tower, where the mine workers would move up and down the material. And this is such an iconic feature that a lot of people learn to love. But what is also interesting is that these working communities that used to, with livelihood, depended on the coal mines in the past, several generations of them still live in the neighborhood, and this place still has meaning for them. So now they're in this act of transforming this into a new big urban neighborhood. Everything is cleared, apart from those elements that they decide to keep as a memory of the industrial heritage. And around this happens a lot of activities that are about making meaning of this and seeing what its future will be as a kind of cultural expression. And there's a highlighted, this is a cooling tower of a power station on the side, on the left, the tower that I mentioned, and then just ordinary pipe work outside the power stations. They're part of that industrial aesthetic of these places of hard industry. And then you got artistic expression of ordinary people in this, who essentially might be called amateur artists, who get involved in meaning making a lot, would take photographic materials, take the iconography, and transform it into objects that harken back to the kind of heritage. You see them being incorporated into the civic landscapes of former coal mining heaps being turned into public parks, where these objects are placed in. Here you got a bottle where you can buy some schnapps, locally produced, with the say, Glück auf, good luck. This is stuff like people would say, Glück auf, is this a song that people would sing before they go down. It's a kind of blessing. You're going down the mine that you're all safe. And you can see that tower that is showing you before, it's actually here etched in as an image. You would expect this really to be done. This would be, you would see something like a palace normally, wouldn't you? With these kind of objects. When you go to a tourist shop in London, you would see probably Big Ben be displayed on it or something like that. Here, it's a local industrial heritage element. that's featuring on it. So this is an act of meaning making and transformation that's quite grassroots led. So pieces of work. So when we've been thinking about even significant buildings, and we got lots of here in Chatham too, here is you'll probably recognize this is the Natural History Museum in South Kensington in London. It's a place where I take our students very often to do classes with objects. And here, what is really, I think, interesting about this building, you might recognize it immediately. It's a civic building that's very boldly a civic building that expresses its civic pride very clearly architecturally. But with buildings like this, one thing that we tend to maybe overlook sometimes, that the ingenuity of these Victorian buildings, so this is 1870s, a building constructed in 1870s, in an age of industrialization that was shaped by the technological innovations of its time, that you might not recognize unless you did a bit of research into them. And here we've got the interior, the fine interiors that we might still recognize and preserve. But what we tend to overlook, when we're looking a bit more closer, that there are sort of quite ingenuities in this design that are of more technical nature. So here we've got a mechanically operated window with a mechanism where you can open and close the windows. And when I go with my students there, we open and close them so they can see it all in action. Here, this is actually in the library, and then in the library they've got fire doors and fire dampers from the 19th century, original ones, that are expressing something about fire safety in the design of public buildings. This is actually for archive and library building. The Moorhen Library now belonging to King's College London, but we use the Public Record Office building. So a very important civic building. But we're seeing layers here that are of a technical nature that we might overlook. They're significant. And similarly, back to the Natural History Museum, we might look at the back of house areas, the courtyards inside, that you as general visitors can't see unless you've got special permission, like myself, and go on the roofs and have a look down into the courtyards that you really can only see from the roofs. You see the rather more plainness of those functional courtyards, and they're saying very much something about the utilitarianism that was embraced by the Victorians in architectural design. In industrial buildings, we're seeing it face on. In civic buildings, they're often hidden away a bit more. We're seeing the chimneys here of the central heating system of the Natural History Museum disguised as campanile, as Italian campanile. But actually, they are part of a technical innovation that at that time was quite groundbreaking and changed the way we think about the environment and buildings. So we might say, this is a layer of environmental intelligence of the Victorian era being expressed here, but it can also be more recent expression. And here we got an example here of a plant room. And you might be thinking, why would we look at plant rooms and heritage? And I think what is interesting is a lot of these innovations are expressed in spaces that are forgotten and not really studied. And this is one area in my academic research I'm looking a lot into, is actually understanding the socio-technical histories of buildings. How are buildings operated? What's the role of technology? What's the role of people in it? So here's a House of Commons rebuilding in the Second World War, where the plant room would feature even in the popular press. The Illustrated London News would publish a whole 2-page spread article about the rebuilding of the House of Commons with a big picture of the plant room in it and its air conditioning system. So they were really proud of it being an expression of progressiveness after the Second World War. A lot of these technologies were unthinkable without the war because most of these were invented and advanced, including a periscope and control panel systems, electric control panel system that you would see in submarines and destroyers. So here is now controlling the air conditioning system and lighting in the House of Commons chamber. The historic picture shown in a rather more grand fashion, and here a picture as it would have looked like in the 1980s before it was ripped out. But one thing we might still forget is the people working in them. So we might here really talk about a history of anonymity. So we've got an anonymity of particular spaces, but we also got an anonymity of those people who lived and work in these spaces. So in this case, the people who operated the air conditioning system and looked after these control panels, without them, there would have been no House of Commons debates. So in other words, that's as essential to make Parliament work as a Prime Minister, if you believe it or not, technologically. And interestingly, I've actually met some of these people because they're retired now and interviewed them as part of my research, trying to uncover some of those lost histories behind them. We would call them oral histories. And there was a shift in engineers in the 1990s, and that's all the tail end of this old system before modern computers took place, replaced them. So, does that make sense so far? It's sort of really what I mean by marginal here, really the different ways what I mean by marginality in architecture. So, and I just want to highlight this is that when we're thinking about valuing the built environment, and we're thinking it in terms of conservation principles, so that's a very narrow way of looking at the built environment, we got what we call values. And they're not going to go into much into the details about what these values on the top mean, those 12 core values that English Heritage had formulated, part of its conservation principles, policies, and guidance. But what is really important is that when we think about heritage, it's value-driven. So if you think about significance in buildings, for instance, the heritage significance of a building, it is value-driven. We have to make, of course, a justification, but in the end of the day, underlying all of this is our values, and they are often the values of our own times. And we might see, if you're looking at the statue of Elsa Colston, that we know it's Colston's earlier, and we apply the values of our own time, and then let's say we would travel back in time 50 years ago, the values would be very different. But here we got the values of professional heritage conservationists being given the privilege to make judgments about the built environment. And we got these 4 core values that we're using to judge the historic environment. And the details, that doesn't matter. It's just the fact that these are essentially professional values. And what I wanted to sort of add to that, and to take it up really into a modern age, is to seeing whether, when we're thinking about it purely in terms of heritage significance, do we need to expand those terms? Actually, some buildings might not be seen as having heritage value at all. Instead, they may have instrumental value. And this, I mean, functional values. So they think about the social housing estate that still functions and houses people low income, that has functional instrumental value, regardless of its architectural significance. And then we got another one, is the sustainability value. So what does it mean if you demolish a building in relation to our environment and climate change and being stewards of resources? Does that make us rethink what we value as preserving, because it has a functional value, because it has a sustainability value? And I just want to highlight that most of you will know that actually demolishing buildings has a huge impact on the global, the construction of new buildings and the demolition, etc., has a huge impact on the global carbon emissions. So here you can see building materials and construction is 11% of the overall global carbon emission. That's of course not as high as building operations, which is 3 times as much almost, but still a considerable chunk. And as our buildings become more efficient, the preserving of building becomes a much bigger slice in the pie. So it's really important to realize that. So we're calling that embodied carbon. So the carbon that's invisible but embodied in the new buildings that we construct. And the embodied carbon we can save by keeping a building rather than demolishing and rebuilding it. So we got historic embodied carbon in any of those 1970s and 80s buildings around the corner. When we demolished them, we lost those. And we're adding more to the environment. And there's been a debate around this, and I don't know whether you remember and follow this in the news, about the store, the Marks and Spencer's flagship store on Oxford Street. Backwards and forwards, across different political administrations. And the debate was here whether it should be permitted to demolish a fine building that's perfectly fit for purpose, in a sense. It could be adapted or whether it could just be demolished and replaced without any resistance. And eventually the permission was given, but it took quite a while. So we got here 2021, the decision was made, and then the final one being made in 2024. So a number of years there was a debate in central government around whether a building like this should be demolished and rebuilt, whether that should be accepted in the light of a climate emergency. So just to put that in the room, it makes a point. And what is interesting is, this is a building that's just around 100 years old, but we have actually buildings that have not just around 30 years old that are already being discussed whether it should be demolished and rebuilt. And there has been here push back here, for instance, Canary Wharf, another Thatcherite experiment that's done quite well, actually. It's a kind of flourishing kind of neighborhood now compared to what it used to be 20 years ago. And there are now buildings that were built in the early stages of Canary Wharf that are now considered to be demolished. When there's a question, should they not just be adapted? Are these buildings not adaptable enough? It just becomes a modus operandi to just demolish and rebuild. And here is actually the HSBC has decided not to demolish, but to rebuild and adapt. And just to put this into perspective, if you're thinking about a building over its lifetime, the environmental impact of just the building fabric itself, so not the operational emissions of a building, but the energy and emission that's associated with building, operating, and demolishing buildings, you need to think it over a time period. So here's a timeline. This is from the Letty Guide for London, where you got essentially a building being completed. So the carbon that was emitted to build a new building over here. Then here you got the operational carbon in yellow, and then you got the carbon invested in upgrading the building to new needs over time. But you can see that those upgrading interventions are quite small. They're really minuscule. And then you end up with a building coming to the end of its life. So we call it a life cycle perspective. So anything that we keep and adapt, so the longer we can prolong the demolition of a building, the more carbon we will save in the immediate future. And the possibility of actually getting buildings up to modern standards is perfectly reasonable. So here is a rather radical example. So the German Passivhaus standard, I don't know whether you're familiar with this, but it's essentially an incredibly ambitious, but fully practically feasible building standard that you might think can only be applied to modern buildings. Here, the municipality has in Freiburg decided to take a 1960s social housing project and retrofit it to Passivhaus standard. So that kind of retain and adapt doesn't mean we come up with sort of half-baked solution. Things are not quite as good as new build. No, that's not the case. This is just a point being made here. These buildings are better than any standard housing project in Britain, multiple times over in terms of efficiency. You could have probably, in terms of carbon emission, probably built about 4 of those equivalent, just by building regs alone. Just a building reg standard developer house would be considerably less efficient than that retrofitted social housing project. And also thinking about, this is about retaining instrumental value that we're doing. We're not only just because they're upgrading them to modern environmental standards and reducing fuel bills for people who have low incomes anyway, who might suffer from fuel poverty otherwise. So there's a social mission as well, environmental one. Here we've got these fantastic projects in Bordeaux in 2016 by Lacaton Vassal, where they actually transformed rather bland social housing projects with rather tight spaces into a modern housing scheme without demolishing it. They essentially retrofitted it with a new facade that adds balcony to the front and creates little glazed rooms up in front of the old facade. A complete transformation. So what we're having here is the heritage is still there of the French welfare state, but it's been transformed into and brought into the modern age. We're not losing it, we're transforming it. We find a British example of this, wonderful British example here in Sheffield, Park Hill, where Splash, it was like a Robin Hood Gardens at the time, a well-celebrated urban modernist urban housing development that fell into this decay and was close to facing demolition. But we had then architects and urban planners working together, and landscape architects working together to transform these buildings into housing fit for our age. So they didn't demolish, they adaptive reuse they went. And what's interesting is these buildings are not just the buildings, but the urbanism that came with it. And very often a lot of post-war housing development, one of the problems is they do have serious problems in terms of the urban landscapes between them. But in this project here in particular, looked at the urban realm as well as the buildings, of actually retrofitting and retaining and adapting the urban realm too. So here we got now the modern landscape being inserted into these blocks, these courtyards of the modernist kind. And this sort of idea of actually of a transformation that has both a social and an ecological dimension. So we're retaining the heritage and memory of the welfare state, we're transforming the spaces to give them more social value by becoming actually more useful socially as for the people living there, because a lot of these places were previously just car parks. So now they're becoming actually community spaces. And when we're thinking about, again, industrial buildings, so we are back in Germany in the big Ruhr area. And the Ruhr area is a really fascinating case study because they deliberately didn't want to erase all of the industrial heritage, but use that industrial heritage as a starting point for culturally driven transformation. So this is a picture of the dirty old industry that some people might have a slightly romantic view of. Why aren't we going back to the coal age and find work again? You know, you might find up north in England people making those arguments, and understandably they had those traumatic experience under the Thatcher years. But one thing is, we're moving on in the 21st century, and but one big question is, what do we do with these places that were essentially scars on our planet when they were originally used? There were places that were polluting the environment, children and families all exposed to pollution that were very harmful. The natural environment around these places was defaced by them. Plants couldn't really grow naturally anymore. Water was polluted. So there was an environmental disaster, these projects, for the people as much as the environment. We are part of the environment. Now, these are places of biodiversity. So these places have been preserved as the heritage and transformed into urban parks and part of actually an inter-urban cycling highway that links all of these sites together. But what we now get, we get an example of biodiversity net gain here, because something that was in terms of biodiversity completely suppressed is now flourishing in terms of biodiversity. Now you're seeing rare species flourishing in these post-industrial landscapes. So we're touching on ecological renewal as well as maintaining culture of an industrial past that shaped places like Germany and Britain and France and Belgium in enormous ways. And here you can see it almost becomes like a romantic setting, doesn't it? These are the former steelworks in the Ruhr district, now being turned into parks. Rather than being Hampton Court standing in this park, there's industrial edifices that are now thriving places because they serve the communities around them. Large, several million people that live in those communities. So that coming to sort of the end of the little bit of more looking at this more global perspective, etc. And we might think about going back to learning from Las Vegas. You might ask, what is the Vegas of Chatham? And what I'm here thinking in particular, where we probably come closest to this in terms of era, are probably the 70s and 80s, where we got to sharing in consumers' culture, entertainment, and the car, the celebration of the car, and so on, of surrendering our urbanism to a future that was imagined at the time to be the future, which is the freedom of the car and so on, and the kind of urbanism we needed to make that expressed unapologetically. So we have in Chatham eras where the city becomes just a place of car parks, and car parks. And we can still say that's still the truth today. I and Chloe, we came by car, I have to admit. We shared the car, but we use all of these car parks. So, and the car has a place in society. So I'm not making here a case of an anti-car movement, but we maybe have to make an argument of a kind of rebalancing act. And just to show this, I've done a little bit of exercise here, just mapping a little bit of the extent of car parking. So dark blue is surface car parking and light blue is multi-story situation or rooftop scenarios. So quite an extensive part in the area too that is dedicated to just parking cars. And this is in some ways a legacy. It is a legacy that shaped the urban fabric of Chatham in enormous way, just in the same way as done Las Vegas. Not quite as bold and as expressive as Las Vegas, but certainly it's the same culture of a concentricity. Here's just an area view, and just I think what is really interesting about the view, the pattern of the car, the module of the car parking lot, the individual units are sort of making a really strong imprint, aren't they? If you just look at one pictures on Google Earth. And also the old infrastructure that shares this. So a lot of gray spaces. We got monuments to the car park in terms of stacking them, realizing that actually if you park everybody on the surface, the whole city needs to be demolished and there would only be a car park left. It's of course not feasible. So they ended up with a multi-car scenario. Then putting things on top of buildings. When we got this sort of landscapes of places where you get to parking spaces, associated places of consumerism, the Pentagon Center here. So we got a really distinct urbanism that's associated with that kind of lifestyle. And here is boldly expressed in purpose-built building in this case. So this was built in the 70s, and I found some newspaper clippings of this, which I'm going to show you later, of actually showing they're very, very proud of this as being this model of accommodating the car in the city, and coming even international news, believe it or not. So this is purpose-built car-centric architecture, but very often the car ends up in leftover spaces. We're seeing this a lot here in Chatham. So these are places in Chatham where we got car parks at the back of buildings, in between things, in between spaces. But you just see it everywhere. So spaces that might have been at one point work yards or green spaces in some instances are now becoming these places where the car is to be accommodated. And then we got these car parking places sitting right next to little jewels of 19th century or early 20th century heritage of Chatham, the Hill pumping station, sitting right against the infrastructure of the period. Similarly, we got this significant church building here, sitting right next to the car park. So this car park becomes, just in the same way that casinos in Las Vegas become the kinds of jewels that sit in parking lots. Not quite as extensive, but the principle is there. You know, we got land, all the large expensive land dedicated to the car, and then with jewels or buildings sitting in it. So we got it here in a more modest way, but the sentiment is similar. So the culture of the car, we also got the architecture, what they call consumerism. And when I say consumerism here, I'm not meaning in a judgmental way, but just as the fact that it was a kind of culture of its time. And we got temperature consumerism. They don't quite look like the way they did in the 70s. The Pentagon shopping center has been actually adapted quite a bit since it originally built. So its modernist qualities have been partially lost in the slightly postmodernist kinds of pitch roof interventions. The building in the 70s is an expression of a kind of consumerist, developer-led kind of development of creating indoor shopping centers. And it used to look like this. And it was much more strongly a modernist kind of expression of architecture. We find other buildings where, which is interesting, I find, we got a high street that is full of commercial buildings from different era. Particularly the ones that maybe was paying attention to are the ones from the Art Deco period and the immediate post-war era, so the late 40s and early 50s, where we got quite a simple kind of functionalist modernism, so of red brick, concrete framed windows. Here is Primark, a contemporary retailer, taking over a building that would have had a different kind of retail in it originally. And this completely changing over from one retail to another is just part of urban life. And the kind of challenges we have in the high street we are having now are maybe bigger in scale, but they're not a new phenomena. We got bank buildings, which is in its own topography, where various bank, one bank forms after another. So here another case of building that we might sort of ask a question about. These are the kind of commercial architecture, and they are not buildings that are soulless. They have qualities, even if they're quite plain and simple. The one building that I really love, and it's just across over here, is this 1950s building with this ornamental tile work. Which a lot of these buildings have disappeared. This is all over Europe. You see that the 1950s stock in particular really disappeared really rapidly. Some of it because it was built meant to be only temporary, but these are little monuments to an era of the immediate post-war era, just in the same way as in Düsseldorf. You know, the grey architecture of Düsseldorf. This is an example in Chatham. And we also got just the ordinary corner shop in either a Edwardian or Victorian terraced house. There's also part of the heritage here and adds to its richness. Even if you not necessarily always agree with the aesthetics, but it's an expression of the immediate expression of the kind of culture. We might also think about offices, light industry and commercial. So you've got this big building, Mountbatten, just right across the road here. Fortunately, it's in scaffolding. Well, very good, because this means it's been looked after. But so this is again a kind of a building that's of its time. And there's a whole history of whether office buildings really have a future, or whether this building really ever be viable when it was built as a commercial venture. But this is the architecture of offices, as commercial office development. And we got places like this, which is actually a sorting hall here, of the post office. And you might think, these are just like out of town of kinds of retail sheds kind of building. But if you actually look closer to it, it actually has details. So here you can see the ornamental trees almost. At the base of build, rustification, classicists would call this rustification. In the building is actually modernist. So we might sometimes be too quick to judge buildings like this. And there's sometimes the little details with dignities of buildings like this that you might dismiss as being particularly valuable, but they have layers to them. And then we end up back to the industrial heritage, which is more recognized, but belongs to the same groups of buildings. So here we got the 1920s industrial machinery itself might be considered the heritage as well as the buildings associated with it. These are the kind of urban plant rooms of Chatham. So that is finishing that part of it, and now I'm coming to this sort of bit that concludes the theoretical section, is because one thing I want to really relate this back to is we got essentially in Chatham we got these design codes being developed, which what I think is really important to realize is the design codes aim to steer transformation of Chatham. And then embedded in it is a strong philosophy of retain and adapt. But what is also important to realizing is in the way it wants to see Chatham to transform is underpinned by a set of values, of the values of our own time, of what we consider to be the city of the future in terms of being a sustainable city, for instance. What a kind of direction in terms of its commercial context, etc., is taking, what the role of education might be in the future of Chatham's development and so on. These are embodied values in it. This is really important to realize. And these embedded values we need to become aware of when we're thinking about how we might apply these in practice in an environment that is not homogeneous, that actually has a lot of code-breaking elements in it. as the way it is at the moment. So, and I wanted to also highlight this one thing. It's about it. Danko talks a lot about the character of Chatham. We want to preserve the character of Chatham, and it does make a sort of judgment of what he considers to be the character. It talks about low-rise character and the fine grain. And if I'm seeing this, it makes me almost thinking of Chatham in the 1930s. And on the table, you got actually one map from Chatham in the 1930s. And you can really honestly talking about a fine grain then. So they were code compliant. They were code compliant in the 1930s. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this, but we just need to highlight this. We might have these ambitions, but we got a grain of Chatham, and it's not quite like that at the moment. And in particular, I just highlight those buildings I mentioned before. We're thinking about the Bryan Street Towers. We're thinking about the former Debenhams, the Mountbatten House, the Pentagon, etc., are really at odds with those principles. And the question comes is, so how does a code like this make these sort of expression, how do we engage with the complexity and contradiction of the current Chatham in that respect? Are we remodeling Chatham according to a particular image? You know, this is sort of a question. Are we the new the palace in Berlin? Are we trying to recreate something, Chatham that was of another era, or where maybe pre-Thatcher? This is just a question. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but just a way of opening up a conversation. So, and of course, the design codes as we've seen them from Chatham, they haven't come out of a vacuum. They have been influenced by the National Design Guides from 2021. And again, this design guide is strongly embedded within them our values, our 21st century values. And they come up with 10 characteristics. And each of these characteristics are values in some ways. So here, this is actually the diagram that's in the guide, the National Model Codes Guide, essentially, where we got actually 3 groupings of characteristics, and not only 10 characteristics, but they're also grouped. So we got the climate emergency, and I would expand this really the environmental emergency, because we got biodiversity too, and environmental destruction in that way. We got the question of community, of empowering local people, and feeling they're really part where they're living in, that they're shaping their own environment, rather than things being superimposed onto them. And we got the idea of a character of place. All these 3 values are very much of our own time. And they're really important to work with. So this is to be aware of that. And then sitting within this, we have then these value groupings that are very much in our climate emergency situation. We're talking about resources. We're talking about the sustainability of the new homes that we build. And we're talking about the mixture of uses that we are accommodating in the built environment. And then we got, for instance, going to community, we got the questions about public space and access to nature. And then we got character. We're actually talking about quite a lot to do with identity and built form. So when we're thinking about these coal mine example, for instance, showing there's a lot to do with identity, but also a lot to do with placemaking. Because these spaces, these hostile work, these industrial environments are turned into places suddenly through landscapes, but adding to the access to nature element. So we're seeing that actually these development that we're seeing in Germany developing, touching on these values in a quite significant way, despite the fact that some of these go back to the 90s and late 80s, when it started, the Emscher Park project. So when we are looking at our own Chatham guides, I've picked up here one quote from it, which I think captures something where we're really seeing sort of the idea of values being expressed. And I put him as keyword then red on the side, just picked them out as text. But I just want to read out this text because I think it just really captures something, that this is really about the values, our values of our time. So existing buildings should generally be retained and enhanced where possible. So it's like Las Vegas, isn't it? So we want to work with what's there. Where it is possible, retaining embodied carbon and local character whilst enabling creative adaptive reuse. New buildings will interpret Chatham's history, so interpret, and contribute to the local sense of place, and promote leading sustainable design principles. And leading sustainable design principles. Under that, of course, our current values, what we consider to be those sustainable principles. So, so that is what is the framework through which we now looking at our built environment. But we also got those of the past, and we got those of our present at the moment. These are future orientated. And I put this together as a basic diagram. I think about what we're essentially doing here is the future planning values that are our design codes. Whilst we might be dealing with past values that are embodied in the built environment, whether it's a statue, a civic building, or the plant rooms of Chatham, like a pumping station, but you also got our present values, our current way of life, and the kind of meaning we project onto buildings that might shape them, the way we adapt them, and so on. So this trialogue, as you might call it, is something I think is really critical. I think with any of these kind of decision of how we might apply this code to the reality of Chatham as Vegas. So, and here again, is another code which I think is really getting us to that sort of point, is where it's actually giving a bit more meat to the kind of values and image of the future city. As an existing building is often the most sustainable, existing buildings should be retained and enhanced. So it repeats that point. A process of retrofitting can be undertaken to improve energy efficiency, while intensification, where possible, can expand the intensity and use of existing buildings. And retaining links to the past. So what we actually have got in this quote, we got all quite core elements here being brought together in one quote. So it talks about all the multiple layers of rethinking our built environments, where sustainability plays an important role, but also cultural meanings of things that belongs to the past, the way we use the spaces, whether we can even increase the usability of spaces and so on, and their usefulness. And it also makes up something which will actually say something about our current state. And I think this is really important. So Chatham, so it makes a statement, Chatham will be designed for people, reducing current dominance of cars and associated infrastructure, whilst promoting human scale design. So it here makes clearly a value position in terms of what there and where he wants to move. So move towards more places for people, away from car-centric urban planning. Existing streets that have inactive frontages, empty, undeveloped sites, and significant areas of surface car parking will be prioritized for new development with active frontages to promote active streets and passive surveillance for safety. So very clearly, clear steer. So these are our values. And what I've done, taking this, I sort of developed kind of expanding on this, a little framework diagram, which we're going to actually be using in the workshop. And is actually on the tables. I've got 2 copies of this. And I also got a 3rd copy, which I might just hand to the audience not sitting on the table. And just have a look at this as well. So this is a kind of diagram that I produced. I'm trying to put this together as a sort of framework of thinking. So I began with really talking a lot about this sort of question of meaning making. So we got cultural values here on the red area. So we got the retain and adapt. That's the core principle of the code. Is the premise is we're going to demolish only as a last resort. We're going to retain and adapt. And so when we think about retaining and adapt, we need to be making sure that we're making that decision in a balanced way. Because certain decision might be made very quickly if you only look at through one lens. So we're thinking about memories of past culture. So the buildings that are representing a particular cut, they are giving us a memory of past culture. And then there's also that question of meaning of existing edifices and spaces to people today. So what do these past cultures actually mean to people today? So people might interpret them in their own way today. And then comes this question, when we add new layers, that is an expression of an emerging new cultural identity that we're anticipating. And that we have seen in this coal mine, the last coal mine to close, when they're starting with these activities of meaning making. To know they make objects, artists coming in to make responses to the cultural identities that might be reflected in space and what kind of cultural identities might gain in the future. And they're already taking part in it, they're already doing it by having festivals, major festivals happening on these industrial grounds, popping up there as a starting point of thinking about this being a place of culture. So it's really important to realize that we are essentially, with the design code, we are engaging a lot in this, but we need to relate it back, also relay it back to those two other layers. So what it means to us today and what it meant to the people in the past. Then on the other side of the spectrum, we need to also balance this question. So you might come to a conclusion, are we going to demolish on the basis of the red? But then climate change and environmental crisis comes in. Oh, there's something missing. I think we should be on this. The biodiversity net gain branch should be on there too. Some of them missing here. So we got this sort of agenda to reduce carbon emissions. So if we don't demolish, we reduce carbon emissions. We can retrofit buildings and reduce the operational carbon by retrofitting the buildings, just like that social housing with Pacific Standard. We're thinking about the impact of sustainable mobility and what sustainable mobility is, a move away from car-centric planning to a stronger emphasis on public transportation and shared car ownership, enabling maybe more intensity and diversity of use, for instance, having then suddenly a social benefit. And this instrumental value here comes in, where we might rethink about the instrumental value of a car park against creating a new affordable housing project on it. And you have to weigh up what is the relative instrumental value here. But also when it comes down to retaining a social housing project, there will be a similar kind of question because it's to do with it. So does that make sense? So you need to essentially always sort of almost turn the kaleidoscope around before we can really come up with a nuanced, balanced decision about retain and adapt where possible. But how will you get to that decision?